Today, I am going to discuss 3 different principles that will help a learner to attend to the essential material and to avoid focusing on extraneous information. This is done through effective instructional design, and the principles that will be discussed follow Mayer and Fiorella's 2014 suggestions on how to focus the learner, thus increasing the amount of information a learner can commit to long-term memory. Following this discussion will be a short 3-slide presentation on inclusion in physical education. And each slide has been designed to exemplify one of the 3 principles discussed. As I go through the second part of this presentation, see if you can identify which principle is being observed in each slide. You can see in this picture that there is a theme of redundant text in that story, especially if I were to show this slide and then read word for word everything on the slide to the learners. The redundancy principle states that a learner will learn and commit information to their long-term memory better when he or she is presented with graphics, in this case a picture, and text, or narration and graphics, but not all 3 at once. The idea is to reduce the amount of words they are having to focus on, so that will be both written words and narrated words that are being presented at the same time while the student is trying to pay attention to a picture as well. A learner can be overloaded if he or she has to process too much information through the auditory and visual channels of cognitive processing at once. The cognitive load theory looks at information that we cannot acquire on our own. It is information we have to get from someone else, such as a teacher. When someone is attempting to acquire new knowledge, there are different types of cognitive load that we experience. The one that relates to the redundancy principle is that of extraneous cognitive load, or load that learners experience as a result of the instructional design being ineffective. Being redundant is an example of an ineffective cognitive load. In the picture, you see this person being overloaded with too much information at one time: pictures, narration, and text. The redundancy principle also works according to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, in that this principle asserts that the instructor should try to eliminate as much redundant text as possible. For example, in this slide, I put a picture and a heading and am narrating the slide. I am following the redundancy principle because I did not write out my narration on the slide itself, thereby helping you to avoid cognitive overload. Had I placed bullet point text on this slide as well as the picture and then read the text to you, that would put you in a situation where you might enter into cognitive overload, and you will not be able to learn from this slide. Let's say that I am teaching children how to spell the names of the animals shown in the pictures on this slide, and this is the first time they have seen the animals' names written down. As you can see, the names are not next to the animal. Instead, they are far away and not on the same line as the actual animal itself. When following the spatial contiguity principle, an instructional designer or teacher should place the word right next to the picture to save the learner from having to visually scan back and forth across the slide. This is an example of the spatial contiguity principle, where the words are listed right beside the picture, so the learner does not have to look back and forth across the slide. According to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, one of the ways we can help learners to manage the extraneous information they are taking in is by making sure we place the words next to the pictures rather than spreading them apart. By doing so, we are allowing them more time to process the information and are avoiding the extraneous overload due to an ineffective design of the presentation. The third principle to help reduce extraneous cognitive overload is the signaling principle. By utilizing the signaling principle, the teacher is pointing the learner's attention to the important components of the presentation. The idea behind this principle is that it teaches the learner to focus on the information that is important to the lesson. In the example on this slide, this is something we would want to avoid because not only is it using poor grammar, but it also does not point the learner to anything important. Whereas, in the sample above, if I were teaching a unit on proper nouns, you can see that each proper noun is highlighted and underlined in the paragraph that shows on this slide. This principle also works with the cognitive theory of multimedia learning because it helps to reduce extraneous overload on the learner by indicating where the learner should focus his or her attention. There is no adding to or taking away of the information presented on the previous slide you just saw, but the change in font highlights what the learner needs to learn. Inclusion and physical education. Inclusion in physical education can mean many different things. In this case, the picture above exemplifies a student with a disability participating in a team activity with his peers who do not have disabilities. Inclusion is not mandated by law, however. According to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, students with disabilities should be placed into the least restrictive environment, which is the place where that student can be the most successful. It might be an inclusive setting, such as in the picture, but it might also be in a more segregated setting where only students with disabilities participate. In an inclusive setting, you have an instance where individuals both with and without disabilities are being educated together. All are active and all are engaged in the lesson. The example on the left in the picture shows an inclusive physical education class. You can see there's one student in a wheelchair and 3 students on the outside of the parachute, holding onto the parachute, who don't have disabilities. In this case, this boy in the wheelchair is being included and is actually participating in the physical education lesson with his peers who do not have disabilities. On the other hand, when students with disabilities are placed into adapted physical education settings, they are educated only with other students who have disabilities. You can see in the picture on the right, all the students who are shown are in wheelchairs. So this would be an example of an adapted setting where everything has to be adapted for the students in the class. In an adapted setting, student numbers are typically much lower because the disabilities tend to be more severe and require more attention, versus inclusive settings where there may be one teacher to 30 or more students. IDEA mentions physical education as the only subject matter that students with disabilities are required to take, making physical education a direct or required service for all students with disabilities who have an individualized education plan. Any other service that is not required by law would fall into the related service category. This means that an individual might have a disability and may also have an individualized education plan, but this individual may not need services such as speech therapy if they're able to speak with no problem.